Morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Terry Sweet. As chair of the company, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 7th Annual General Meeting of shareholders of Proteomics International Laboratories. It's now after 9:30 a.m. and as we have a quorum of shareholders present, I declare the meeting open. The notice convening today's meeting was made available to shareholders on the 26th of October 21 and lodged with ASX on that date. Consequently, I'll take the notice as read. Firstly, let me introduce the members of your board. Present in person are Dr. Richard Lipscombe, Managing Director, Mr. Paul House, Mr. Neville Gardner, and Ms. Karen Logan, Company Secretary. Present by video link are Dr. Robyn Elliott in Melbourne and Mr. Roger Moore in Sydney. Also present here today is Mr. Neil Smith, representing BDO, our independent auditor. I would particularly like to welcome Dr. Elliott and Mr. Gardner, who have recently joined the board of PIQ, and who between them bring a wealth of experience in technical, corporate, financial, and commercial areas. As you'll know, at the end of this AGM, I'll step down from the board of PIQ, and Mr. Gardner will take on the role of chair of your company. Since listing on ASX in 2015, the company has made great progress, steadily building on the small private company founded by Dr. Lipscombe 20 years ago. The positive results of the initial clinical study of ProMarker D have been firmly and conclusively validated by subsequent published peer-reviewed studies. The clinical advantages of the use of ProMarker D tests in assessing risk of kidney disease over current standard of care is unequivocal. The reduction of healthcare costs by predicting who is likely to suffer kidney disease, thereby allowing steps to be taken to avoid or delay the condition, are very significant. Dr. Lipscombe will speak in more detail to the above. However, as I leave the company, these are milestone achievements for which I'm proud to have played a small part. Your company is now poised to deliver this diagnostic test, ProMarker D, for use by doctors for the benefit of their patients. This will not only reward those who've invested in the company, but will fulfill the company's vision to help create a world where disease is detected early and cured simply. I'll now move to the formalities of the meeting, which you've all been looking forward to.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming along today. It's nice to see so many people in the room, and at least seeing one or two new faces is good, and I'm pleased to meet you. So I'm going to give a run through of what we've been doing at Proteomics International this year, where we see ourselves going into the next couple of years ahead. So standard disclaimer. At Proteomics International, we are a medical technology company, and we've positioned ourselves in the area of precision medicine and predictive diagnostics. The main area for us is that diagnostic side, and we are very excited about our product ProMarker D, as Terry just alluded to. We have a predictive test for the early identification of diabetic kidney disease. It's cost effective, it's easy to use, it's patented technology, and it's rolling out. But this is a part of a pipeline of a whole number of novel tests that we have in development across a range of diseases, which I'm going to talk more on later. That's only one side of our business. We have some very specialized analytical services that we provide from our laboratories upstairs here. And if any of you would like a tour afterwards, then you're most welcome. We work in an area which is thriving across the clinical trials area, where we do what is known as pharmacokinetic testing. We also work in the biosimilars area, and those services are provided, as I said, from our laboratories, where we have state-of-the-art capability. We've invested several $1 million in that equipment, which lets us provide those highly accredited services, but fundamentally also underpins our R&D activities, and it's the same instrumentation, same workflows that we use across both sides of the business. Importantly, that cash flow from the R&D does offset the burn that we have from the research and development, and particularly the commercialization of ProMarker D. As you'll see on the right-hand side, that burn is quite small for an organization of our size. The revenue has held firm in the last financial year, despite the downturn from COVID. So that was very pleasing, particularly given that a number of clients in places like India, which is a big market for us, were completely shut down. And so we see that potential revenue to continue to grow through this year and into the future. We are fully funded for what we do. We did a very successful placement at the end of last year, and those funds have been used to increase our cash burn in the areas that we've identified, which is the development of ProMarker-D and its commercialization, and also building that pipeline of tests and taking them to the next stages. It's also allowed us to grow our management team, and we have Vic Malik, who's our new Chief Commercialization Officer, and Jacqueline Gray, our new Chief Finance Officer, in the room with us today, and I'll invite you to talk to them afterwards. But we've also been putting in place additional capabilities across our team, and we have increased capacity in the laboratory, in regulatory, in manufacturing, which is all part of that series of strategies that we've been implementing to grow the business as a whole, and particularly ProMarker-D. I would add that that's an important part of our hybrid business model, not just doing the research and development, but that analytical services that allows us to make the most of our cash balance. We have the R&D tax that will be coming through at the end of this quarter. So with all those things in place, we're very excited about where we sit and where we're heading. I should say it's a very tightly held register, as those of you who observe that the liquidity can be small at times or can be poor, but that's a plus and a minus. As we've seen in the last few days, we can see quite a lot of activity in the share price quite quickly. And the objective for us as a company is obviously to improve that shareholder recognition. And like all CEOs, I would say that our share price is undervalued, even with the small run that we've had in the last few days. So our board of directors, I would like to start first by formally recognizing Terry for what he's done for us over the last several years. He's been a great mentor to me. So I thank you very much for that. And you will be missed. I'm sure you will turn up now and again to annoy us and to ask some interesting questions. So thank you on behalf of the whole company for what you've done. In terms of our new additions to the board, Robyn and Neville, we're very excited about working with you. You're joining a very accomplished group of individuals on the board. I'm privileged to work with Roger and Paul already, who have reams of experience across corporate activity and in the sector. And I think with the board that we now have, we're looking forward to some very dynamic discussions and strategic planning for where we're going to take Proteomics International in the next few years for the next stage of its growth. I'm going to talk now about the technology platform, the area that I love in terms of what we do, where the company has built its capability and is building its intellectual property. We call it ProMarker, and it lets us identify unique protein fingerprints that we can find in the blood or in fact, almost any biological sample. This platform lets us identify and link these unique protein markers to specific diseases. That lets us create our novel diagnostic tests, and that's our intellectual property. And what we've got at the forefront of that is ProMarker-D, a test which we really believe will change lives around the world. It's a new blood test for predicting diabetic kidney disease. And why are we working in this area? What's the problem? What's the solution? My favorite pun, it is a growing disease in terms of the number of people with diabetes today. It's over 460 million worldwide. And the main issue with diabetes is that the complications that it causes. It affects the blood capillaries and they stop working properly. So that can lead to a number of diseases, but in particular chronic kidney disease, where all the blood capillaries in the kidney are affected and damaged. Now, the kidney is a very efficient organ, so this disease is a silent killer. You can lose 80% of your kidney function and you'd have almost no symptoms. You might start to feel a bit lethargic. And at that point, when you go and see your doctor, they're going to say, sorry, there's nothing we can do at this point. We can potentially stabilize you, but you're on the inevitable path to dialysis and kidney transplant. That's obviously a very expensive exercise from a healthcare perspective and devastating from a patient perspective. So that has happened because the current standard of care is simply not good enough. The tests that are used today, they're known as the EGFR and ACR tests. They've been around for 50 years and they were fit for purpose 50 years ago. They're not fit for purpose today. They're not very sensitive. They're not very reproducible, but they are the current gold standard. And that's what we intend to displace. Because the reason that there's so many people with diabetes and chronic kidney disease is because the tests themselves cannot predict the onset of chronic kidney disease. And the consequence of that, as I said, will lead to dialysis. What we've developed with ProMarker D, working with our colleagues in the clinic, is a test that can predict the onset of disease up to 4 years before those clinical symptoms appear. So we're finding that molecular fingerprint in the body. We can identify that long before it's had chance to manifest itself in real clinical damage. And then it's the simple adage, prevention is better than cure. You can intervene early. It's much easier to fix a problem if it starts small and you intervene at that stage rather than waiting for later stage. If we can achieve that, then the kidneys are going to stay healthier for longer. Quality of life is going to be greatly improved for the patient. We're going to defer or even potentially stop those enormous costs to healthcare systems that result at the end of life issues with diabetes. As I said, ProMarker D is ready to roll out. It's a revenue-ready product. And if you were to look at one slide in this presentation for summary of everything that we've been doing, where the test is at, it's where it's going, this is it. I'm going to talk to all of these things in more detail as we go through my presentation. But this is a really important summary. So as we've already said, it's an enormous market. There's huge numbers of people with diabetes. Our test has been through a series of analytical studies, which are all published. We have excellent statistical performance. The test outperforms standard of care. We can pick up these individuals who have the disease before those symptoms appear. We're working with Big Pharma. Janssen, who are part of Johnson & Johnson, they've provided us with access to a multi-center study, and that's allowed us to look at how ProMarker D could affect the treatment options for these patients. So it's a very important body of work. It's a very expensive study that they've run, would be tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to run that study, and they've provided those samples to us. So that's a very valuable collaboration. Now, a key point here is therapeutic treatments are available. They're a class of drug called SGLT2 inhibitors. Obviously, there's no point having a predictive test if you can't do anything about the outcome. So if you know you're going to die from something but you can't change it, then you probably would rather not know. These drugs are a game changer. They're the first in 30 years to show any genuine benefit in the area of kidney disease. They're already an approved class of drug, meaning they're already used for diabetes. And what's been shown by a number of drug companies over the last few years is that they have renal protective benefits and they stop people dying from chronic kidney disease. So that's the answer. So we've now got a test that can predict who's going to get sick, and these drugs are going to be that game changer to stop those people proceeding towards dialysis. We've built the test onto an easy to use platform. Upstairs, we have a very sophisticated platform that's now enabled us to do all this discovery work and create ProMarker D and the other tests that are coming through. That technology is slowly working its way into the clinical pathology labs around the world, but here and now, you need a simple system. And so we've engineered this onto the immunoassay platform, which we also run upstairs. But that's a technology which is highly transportable around the world. Part of this process, we've gone through regulatory approvals across the organization and for our products. So we have CE mark for the ProMarket-E test in Europe. And we also have a specialist accreditation known as ISO 13485, which relates to the manufacture of medical devices. And that's an important accreditation which is required globally for products that will go into the clinic in most jurisdictions. And so an important aspect of what we've been doing over the last several months is working on that manufacturing scale up. We've put in place a number of partners who are highly specialized in these areas in terms of making the reagents that we need for our test and then putting them into a kit. So they have that accreditation, they have that capacity to scale, and that's an ongoing process for us. And that will allow us to meet the demand that we foresee for ProMarket-E into the future. Now, other areas that we have still to tick off, but we've been working on actively. Reimbursement, particularly in the US, is obviously a key issue. There are a number of paths to obtaining that reimbursement code. Importantly, we have published and presented at major conferences the economic health benefit of running ProMarket-E, meaning how much money could we save healthcare systems if we implemented the test. We've demonstrated the clinical utility of ProMarket-E, meaning do doctors want the test? What would they do with that result if they had it? So they're both key studies which will form part of the dossier that we submit to the panels that implement reimbursement codes through next year. Ongoing regulatory approvals. As we finally announced yesterday, the FDA were able to give us some guidance as to the path for ProMarket-E in the US. Now that will be in parallel with what we've already got for CE mark in Europe. And in particular for the US, they have this specialized route to market, which is the laboratory developed test, LDT, which is the path we're following for ProMarket-E. That lets us run the test there today without having that FDA approval. It's for early adoption. It's exactly for this purpose. And so we will be taking full use of that as well. And of course, it's not quite all about the money, but that's important. So generating sales revenue is our primary objective. And with the distribution agreements that we've been signing over the last year, we are in that position to bring ProMarket-E to market. I'll say at this point, it's obviously been a challenge with COVID-19 for laboratories running any test besides testing for SARS-CoV-2. And so that's a factor which has certainly delayed the rollout of ProMarket-E in our initial target markets. Ultimately, we see this as a benefit. It's allowed us to improve our processes to get that manufacturing closer to scale. And we've also now got potentially a lot of laboratories, a lot of diagnostic organizations with very deep pockets who've been doing very well out of providing this important testing for COVID-19. And we see that as an opportunity for ProMarket-E now to roll out into these labs as they're looking to diversify their portfolio. And also importantly, from a patient perspective, in many parts of the world, it's not been possible to do routine testing for disease. And so that pent-up demand for, in our case, kidney disease, but cardiovascular and other areas is there, and it'll be very important to improve testing. And again, we see ProMarket-E as part of that solution. So our test, we've made it so that it's simple to integrate and to use. It works off a standard blood draw, so it could run alongside a series of other blood tests that would be performed, be that cholesterol, PSA test, ovarian cancer. They're all run off the same blood sample. We analyze our biomarkers for ProMarket-E. We actually measure 3 proteins in our test, and we couple that with 3 simple clinical factors that any diabetes patient would have measured automatically. Obviously, we know how old the patient is, unless they're making it up, but we know how old the patient is. We have that cholesterol measure and EGFR as a standard test today. So those parameters can then be uploaded into the cloud. We use a specialized algorithm that sits behind a highly secure firewall that automatically generates a report. That report can then go back to the testing laboratory, onto the physician, and pass that information on to the patient. And that's the opportunity then to change patient management and to look at other options, change of lifestyle, potential therapeutic drugs. This is an example of how the test report would look. We use a traffic light system. And the reason we do this is it allows us to optimize the performance of the test. There are two objectives when we run ProMarket-E. We want to understand which patients are at high risk of developing diabetic kidney disease. So the first point to emphasize is that these patients, they know they're sick, they have diabetes, but they have no other signs of kidney disease. So the ProMarket-E red zone is about identifying those patients who are likely to develop chronic kidney disease in the next 4 years. Equally important is the rule out capability. So if somebody sits in the green zone, that means that based on our modeling, on our statistics, that individual is highly unlikely to develop kidney disease in the next few years, which offers different opportunities for managing those patients. So in the low risk category, yes, we need standard diabetes management, but we don't need strong interventions. But in the red zone, these are the patients that we're looking at putting on these new SGLT2 inhibitor drugs and improving the general management of their diabetes to stop that progression. And here's some of the data that we've been generating that lets me say that ProMarket-E is an outstanding test from a biochemical, statistical, chemistry perspective. It ticks all the boxes, and we've really done a lot of work to prove the test works. So we've looked at over 5,000 patients now in long-term clinical studies, up to 4 years. And this is where we've been able to show that we can predict the 86% of those otherwise healthy diabetics who go on to develop chronic kidney disease. And these results are all published. Now, as part of that collaboration with Janssen, we've been able to do that international validation study where we looked at their results, that the patients that they had from a completed clinical trial. We tested those patients at the beginning and we looked at how they fared through that trial, and we were able to predict which patients went on to develop disease during that trial. So that was the first stage of what we did. Now, that was what we did last year. What we've done this year is then we've looked at the benefit of these patients being on drugs. So the collaboration stage 2, we're asking that question, that do the at-risk patients, so that's the ones in the red zone in the ProMarket-E test, what happens to them on drugs? Do they continue to decline? Do they stabilize? Do they recover? And in a nutshell, what we're able to show is that those in that red zone got the most benefit from going on the drug early. Their ProMarket-E scores improved. If they were on placebo, their ProMarket-E scores, their risk of developing diabetic kidney disease, the actuality of developing diabetic kidney disease got worse. So what we can do is make that statement that we conclude that we can identify those at-risk patients who are currently asymptomatic for diabetic kidney disease, and with canagliflozin, that's a potential treatment that can improve their renal risk profile. And that's part of the core business case around the adoption of ProMarket-E from a clinician's perspective and from a health economics perspective. In terms of our performance against standard of care, this has been implied in a number of studies that we've done, but we actually completed a formal analysis which we presented at the American Society for Nephrology earlier this month, where we took our group of patients and we looked at which individuals went on to develop diabetic kidney disease, and we asked, how would standard of care do for identifying those patients? And then how would ProMarket-E do for identifying those patients? And the answer is standard of care is atrocious. So standard of care identified none of the patients who went on to develop kidney disease from that group of individuals with diabetes and no kidney function. Those patients who had diabetes but normal kidney function to start with. ProMarket-E can identify those patients who are going to go on to develop kidney disease. So again, that's a really important piece of work in terms of justifying uptake for a test like ProMarket-E and displacing standard of care. As we all need to appreciate, clinicians have their favorites. They do things a certain way, and when a test has been ingrained for 50 years, there's always going to be the, well, this is how we do it. Why would you use a new test? And of course, the answer is, well, if your test was so good, why are so many people dying from kidney disease? And so that's the sort of clinical evidence, though, that we need to help prove Pro-marker D is not just worth adopting, but in due course, I would suggest could become standard of care. The market opportunity for Pro-marker D is enormous. As we said earlier, there's over 460 million people worldwide with diabetes, and that number continues to increase. So on the left-hand side, this shows our patent position, and in those countries, a number of people with diabetes. So if we look at China there, that blue bar, 116 million people in China already have diabetes. So that's our target population. And across the countries where we have patents granted or pending, we cover over 330 million of the world's diabetes patients. We're expecting a test to be performed once a year on average, and we're looking at a test price around that $150 price point. That's based on extensive stakeholder engagement across the sector and with providers, with insurers, with clinicians as to what's a realistic price point for a test like Pro-marker D. And we'd be looking at a standard industry royalty rate in that 5 to 15% range. Now, from the perspective of what Pro-marker D might do in the future, I should add that our patent family was designed for the test to cover diabetic kidney disease. And that's obviously our primary focus today. But in the future, we will look at other forms of kidney disease, other causes of kidney disease. And our patents have been granted for broader use as well. There's also the potential to look at drugs against some of the markers in our diagnostic test. It is theoretically possible that those markers themselves could become targets for improved treatments into the future. And our patents also cover use of those markers in developing or identifying new drug treatments. So they're not areas that we're currently working on, but it's part of our intellectual property portfolio, and it's important to understand the breadth of what we would consider standard housekeeping practice in terms of ensuring that our intellectual property is strong. The route to market, how do we actually make money from this? How do we get the test into the hands of some patients? It's about providing the test to diagnostic companies, to laboratories. We will license the test to those. It can either go through a distributor into those laboratories or directly. Then we have that important area of assay, immunoassay manufacture and supply that I spoke about before. We're working with Biotem in France for that manufacture, for Abcam in the UK, both highly specialized companies with vast experience in producing these products, which they do for a range of major companies worldwide. So that's part of the manufacturing process that we're currently transitioning into Europe, and we anticipate that being completed in Q1 of next year. So in the near term, in the context of this test, we'll be able to generate scale for the Pro-marker D test. And then the lab runs the test. As I said, it submits that data to the hub. The cloud spits out that report. We get a royalty on every test that's sold. Those licensing transactions that we're targeting, very pleased to be able to announce Apicore. We've been in discussions with them for several months to reach this point, but we believe that they're an exciting partner for us because of their ability to interact with the government and professional bodies in the UK. They're well connected to organisations linked to the National Health Service there. As we said in the announcement, the National Health Service spends £10 billion a year on diabetes, and most of that is actually on the complications of diabetes. So that's our target for the future, and we'll be working earnestly with Apicore to get the test into paths that allow us to start providing Pro-marker D to the people of Britain. Italy and Israel remain targets for us. Italy will be the first place that we get commercial sales. They're very close to completing the tech transfer, setup and running of the test in a clinical environment in Italy, and we're still targeting sales for this quarter. Israel, we have put on hold. The regulatory processes are such that it's easier to register a fully ISO 13485 accredited product in Israel, and because we are quite close with completing that transfer process, we've taken the decision that we will wait for that before we pursue Israel further. The other opportunities are global. We're obviously targeting the US. That's a no-brainer. That's the market that everybody wants to be in and expects us to be in. And that's where we see the greatest early adoption of the test in the years to come. So we have a number of discussions that are ongoing in that jurisdiction, but we're also looking at opportunities around the world. As I gave the example, places like China and India have massive markets. Accessing those markets has its own challenges, but we do believe we've got a test that in due course can service populations around the world. So that's ProMarker D. Now I'm going to focus on our technology platform, our in-house intellectual property generator. We're not like some of our peers who just generally try and license other people's technology and can't create their own, don't understand the technology, buy it off somebody else. We don't do that. We generate our own intellectual property. We have a very skilled team operating here that allow us to create new diagnostic tests. So the discovery pipeline, we go through a series of steps in terms of discovery, proof of concept, clinical studies. We always target areas of significant unmet medical need. We're really focused on an area where there's a large number of people with a disease and no existing, or no, what we would say, no adequate diagnostic test. So this offers us an enormous market opportunity in terms of the number of people and revenue potential in terms of being able to be disruptive and come up with a new technology into that space. The next cab off the rank behind ProMarker D will be ProMarker Endo. The endometriosis study I'm going to talk to in a little bit more detail. That's the most mature of our pipeline of tests coming through. We are interested in a range of areas, asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And don't try and say that one quickly after a few beers. That is obviously a huge opportunity in terms of looking at new markers. Diabetic retinopathy, working with our clinical colleagues again, and that we were very successful in developing the diabetic kidney disease test, similar opportunity. Esophageal cancer, working with our colleagues from the Queensland Institute of Medical Research. These are all tests which are showing good progress. We've made some significant advances over this year, and we look forward to providing further updates on them in due course. I'm going to talk about the endometriosis one because I say it's a very exciting test in our hands, but the market opportunity is astonishing. And for the gentleman in the room, we probably don't know enough about this disease, which is embarrassing, but we'll learn a little bit more in our journey working on it. It is a condition which is quite debilitating, I understand. It's where you get tissue growth from outside of the uterus into other areas of the body, causes chronic pain, menstrual irregularities, frequently misdiagnosed as period pain, and that's an area which needs to be changed. So typically takes several years for diagnosis. Current diagnostic is an invasive surgery, a laparoscopy, an incision through the abdomen. So that's an example of a test which needs to be replaced. If we can move to a simple blood test, then that's obviously going to improve the diagnosis of the disease, and that can improve the management of those patients. So it's a disease which is extremely common in Australia. 1 in 9 women, globally similar figures, very expensive disease in terms of difficulty in managing the people affected and costs of diagnosing it currently. Where we're at with ProMarker as applied to endometriosis is that we've identified potential biomarkers that could turn into a new diagnostic test. So we completed our proof of concept study on a relatively small group, but we returned some statistically significant results, which were important for us to be able to say the test can go, the test analysis can go to the next level. We have a patent filed for this invention. And again, after several months of negotiation, we're very pleased to announce that collaboration with the Royal Women's Hospital and the University of Melbourne, where we now have access to the largest clinical biobank of endometriosis samples in the Southern Hemisphere, and one of the largest in the world, to be able to do a clinical validation study on those markers that we have. So there's no guarantee that the ProMarker endo test will be successful, but we have given it every opportunity to be so, and we'll start to generate results. We're currently running the samples now, and we'll have the results in Q1 of next calendar year. At that point, we'll know whether we have a viable test, and it will then continue on that path that we've taken ProMarker D down. So what I'd like to summarize here is what we set ourselves as the targets for 2021 and the achievements that we've actually made. So everything on here we said we were going to do at the beginning of the year, and we've done. The one area which has moved slowly is that first sales, and that's very close. But in terms of the foundation that we now have in place, we have that manufacturing. We've been doing these studies to demonstrate the economic benefits of ProMarker D, the clinical use and clinical utility of ProMarker D. We've had that pivotal study with Janssen, those stage 2 results, which showed that canagliflozin lowers ProMarker D risk scores. We've shown that ProMarker D outperforms standard of care. We've done additional things in terms of moving ProMarker D to the market with our recent distribution agreement for Britain, extra progress on the regulatory side as well, and good to get the FDA recognition of the novelty of the test and a clear path ahead for us. We continue to develop the biomarker pipeline, the ProMarker pipeline, and as in the bottom left corner there, we continue to secure major contracts in the analytical business, which is an important part of the business model, as I said. So our targets for the next 12 months relate to continuing to do licensing deals for ProMarker D. Q1 of next year, manufacturing transfer to our partners, and that's the target for completion of that process. Reimbursement regulatory will go hand in hand with the rollout of ProMarker D in the US, and more news on the ProMarker pipeline. So to add a bit more color to what we see as those significant number of value inflection points, and focusing on the table first, those share price catalysts, they relate to the items I've just identified. We see the near term being the manufacturing FDA regulatory submission in terms of completions, first sales in Europe imminent. And then we have a number of ongoing opportunities in terms of licensing and regulatory news and progressing that whole commercialization of the test. ProMarker pipeline will follow the same process, where we've got some imminent news around the endometriosis and ongoing news updates from the rest of the portfolio. Analytical business is strong and growing. And I want to emphasize that because when we look at the global opportunity for Proteomics International, I genuinely believe that we're in an exciting time, and it's an exceptional space to be in, and it's great to see the activity. As a company, we have disruptive technology, It's cutting edge technology and it's all in-house. So we control our ability to generate new products, be they diagnostic tests or specialist analytical services. ProMarker-D test itself, as we've just been discussing, is at an exciting stage. De-risked, patent, revenue ready, easy to use, scalable, low cost format, high margins. It's also, importantly, in a space where it appeals to the whole of the market, meaning pharmaceutical companies who are generating the drugs that ensure these patients, clinical pathology labs who are going to run the test, the platform developers who want to supply the instrumentation that's going to run tests like ProMarker-D. The diabetes service providers, this is an interesting group because companies that work in the area of dialysis, now there's a number of mandates across the world, the US, China, some other jurisdictions have actually mandated that dialysis companies need to do more to stop people coming into their clinic if they want to get their government contracts renewed. So they're looking at diversifying their business models and saying, well, what can we do to stop more patients coming? We know we're going to make a lot of money out of it already, but we're not going to be able to cope either. So there's a lot going on in the space that we operate. And then obviously the physicians are crying out for new improved tests, and it's going to benefit the patients. So we intersect at all of those points in that market, in that group of individuals who could benefit from the test. As I said, we've got a deep pipeline, potentially globally significant tests in development. And emphasizing this is a vibrant sector across precision medicine, diagnostics, and the contract research organization, the clinical trial sector. There's a lot of activity, there's a lot of interest in developing new products, in trying to bolt together companies who previously ran clinical trials are now being bought by the companies who sell the equipment that are going to analyze the samples in the clinical trial so that they can start to capture some of the things that are going on in that area. The FDA has put out strong guidelines that any new drug coming through clinical trials should have a biomarker that identifies how that drug behaves when that drug goes through clinical trial. So early identification of the outcome of the drug. It's what ProMarker-D does that we've developed. So we're, again, looking at opportunities in that space to say, how can we help? How can we look at our clinical trials area where we do the pharmacokinetic testing? How can we work with companies who are developing these new drugs and apply a ProMarker type approach? Can we find a marker for that company so that their drug will go through clinical trials faster? These are opportunities. These are not areas which are locked in. Merely saying this is a vibrant sector, and this represents the opportunity we have from our diverse business model, from the way that we have the integration of these technologies. So I'm going to finish with a peer comparison. The number of companies on here are Australian-based, and then the company at the top, Renalytix, is the closest competitor to Proteomics International, and arguably the only competitor on the planet. So they have a test similar to ProMarker-D. It's actually for the detection of patients who already have diabetes and already have kidney disease. They're looking at late stage. So according to their literature, they're identifying those patients towards the back end of the process. It's a complex test to run. It does need access to patient records. Currently, we don't see it as a mass market test, but they have a healthy market cap, and they're doing a lot of missionary marketing for us in places. Well, they can only operate in the US. That's the only place where they can get access to the sort of clinical information that they need. But that's an example of other companies in this space, meaning the diabetic kidney disease area. Angiotech, example of a successful diagnostic company selling their products across this market of diagnostics, content diagnostics equipment providers. Bard1, Rhythm Biosciences, both have early stage tests in development, in licensed IP, and we see them as good examples of companies developing products in this space using the same approach as ours. There's going to be more tests that will come through. There's going to be other companies that appear. We currently don't see too many who are actually able to generate their own content. So that's why we think there's an exciting point of difference for us with Proteomics International, as well as just the advanced stage of our test and where that's going to go. So with that, I will thank you for your attention and take any questions.
Richard, well done. Thank you for the presentation. Yeah, nice movement in the share price today as well. And I noticed there's a lot more suits on this side. Usually there's only a few suits there. A couple of quick questions from another shareholder that asked me to ask them for you. They were interested in the development of the US LDT code, LDT test, and how it was going to be rolled out in the US, and how advanced you were with regards to selecting a potential candidate. We've had one previously in the US, but that they weren't really up to the spec. So we're looking at the new guy on the, or a new person or new number of people on the block. When do you think we might be getting close to an LDT test availability in the US?
Yes. So to clarify, first of all, we've never had any partnerships in the US for the immunoassay version of the test. We did look initially a few years ago rolling out the mass spec version, and we do want to emphasize the importance of the switch to the immunoassay, which we've built in the last couple of years. That is the product which we see as being used worldwide from here. Now, those conversations have been ongoing. They continue to be. As I highlighted, the conversation with Uppercore took several months. We are very careful about who we wish to work with. It is a complex space, meaning these diagnostics companies are busy. They're looking at a range of opportunities now, but previously they've been very much focused on COVID-19. The larger the company, the longer those discussions are going to take. We can't say when the next deal will fall, but those conversations are live, and we're excited by where it's heading. And we have product which we are having evaluated in other labs around the world at the moment. So how long that evaluation process takes to complete will depend on the partner, and then the contract negotiation we can't make a comment on. So that's where that sits. The reimbursement code in the US will then follow that path. So what we've decided on doing in consultation with our advisors and specialists in the reimbursement space is that we will wait for ProMarker-D to be on sale in the US. And at that point, we will use a generic reimbursement code, which is an efficient way of going. And we will then apply for a unique code for ProMarker-D once the test is established. And it will allow us to provide a more comprehensive dossier to effectively the American Medical Association, who govern that process. And that will let them look at the test, its potential use, and we can work specifically with them at that stage. So that reimbursement code will follow in a series of stages through next year.
The next one is to do with the Renalytix company. Do you view them as a substantial competitor in the US space? If so, will they be stealing a march on us in the next few months until we have an LDT?
I'm glad Renalytix exists. They make our job a lot easier in the US. Yes, they're a competitor. They're worth $1.4 billion, so they should be able to do something. They have a test which is similar to ProMarker-D. It's not the same. It's currently targeting late-stage disease. It's a harder test to use, in my opinion. So we think that ProMarker-D has got many advantages. But in the meantime, in the US, they have a growing number of groups who are showing interest. So that they're making noise that the current standard of care isn't good enough. And they're now starting to publish some of their data, so we can go head to head with how our test performs in our populations versus how their test performs in theirs, and we're looking forward to that. And so technically, the tests appear similar. The actual statistical performance I can't make comment on at this point. We haven't had that clarity of their data. Financially, their test looks expensive, and ease of use, their test looks difficult to use.
I'll only hold the floor for a few seconds more. The Janssen phase 2 study, that's completed now. Is there any further works with Janssen going forwards, or is this the end of it?
So it's a live collaboration with Janssen until we've finished all the analysis on that data and it's all published. So at the moment we presented the data at conferences. We will go through the process of formal peer review and publishing that. So that's ongoing. And that will continue until the data is been fully analysed, and there's a lot of nuances in there. Bottom line is several thousand patients, plus or minus disease, sophisticated tests like ProMarker D able to predict which patients should get sick and which wouldn't. It's keeping our statistical team busy. They're having a great time. It's keeping the Janssen statistical team busy. So yes, it's an ongoing collaboration, and we'll make announcements around the results as they become available.
Okay, last couple. I noticed that the Ranalytics test $950. When you said 150 for our test, I'm assuming US dollars, or am I assuming Australian?
150 US is what we see as the floor price. There's the potential for the test to be higher. Based on the economic health benefit modeling we're doing, we could potentially justify a higher price. So it's not fixed, but meaning we're not saying it. You'll definitely get it for 150, but for you, Conrad, we might be able to do a deal. Yeah,
well, if I was to rock up in Rome, how much would I pay for in euros for the test in Italy?
We're keeping it simple, so 150 euros. We're just changing the currency in the front.
Thank you. Last one. The endo, which is I'm really quite excited about, is a really interesting bit of space. When this company listed 2015, we were already a little bit further down the ProMarker D path than we are currently with endo, in that we actually had the 86% trials, things that already done. Given the learnings that we've got right now, should the endo be a successful outcome come January, March next year, how long do you think it would take us to get to where we are with endo, or where we are with ProMarker D versus with endo?
It'll be faster than ProMarker D.
Yeah. Happy to hand over.
Thanks, Conrad. Appreciate that. They weren't all your questions, although we normally expect one or two. You've got yours to come. Yes, okay.
Richard, when the company was initially floated, you were looking at, obviously, your prime purpose was the biomarkers research, but you did mention you're going to do research into developing drugs from native animals and vegetation in Australia. Now, I know you've been moderately busy, but have you had a chance to look at that at all?
Well, I keep saying to the lab that they're not really busy enough and that they could do some more. But the serious answer is yes. In the original prospectus, we said we were going to do that. In reality, when we listed at that stage, and as part of the final float, we decided that we'd take that out of the equation to focus on the diagnostics because it was looking so strong. Now, we still believe that technology is exciting, that it's got real potential, and at the right time, we would look at re-entering that. We still have a formal agreement in place with the Northern Territories to access those creepy crawlies so that we could look for venom at the right time. So that is a study which I think is waiting to happen, and other companies have made some advances in that space, developing new drugs from effectively what are peptide-based molecules / drugs. Exciting? Yes, not current. Any other questions? We've got the room until 11, so that
it was just a little clarification on your slide 13. You had the immunoassay kits were manufactured and supplied to the lab. Is that a revenue point as well as the royalty stream?
manufacture and cost of the kits, they'll be sold as much as possible at cost to the laboratory. We see the real potential to make the money off the use of the kit, the test itself. So we would describe it as the printer and inkjet model. You sell the printer at cost, you make your money on the cartridges that go in it. We'll sell the kit as close to possible at cost, and we'll make the money out of actually running the test.
That's it. Thank you.
On that basis, if there are no further questions, thank you very much for coming. There will be refreshments outside. I invite you to meet other members of the team that are here. The directors, obviously, you've seen. Thank you again for coming, and we look forward to an exciting year ahead.